you for joining us for today's Ipsos Lunch and Learn webinar, exploring Canadian perspectives on energy and resources in a shifting economic landscape. Throughout today's session, you will remain in listen-only mode. However, throughout the webinar, please submit your questions online using the Q&A feature. Time permitting, our plan is to answer questions at the end of today's session. However, if time runs short, then your question will be answered by email. I also want to encourage you to take a look at the handouts we've uploaded into the webinar control panel. Today's session is being recorded and will also be directly emailed to you. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's discussion moderator, Cameron McFadden, Vice President of Strategic Growth for Ipsos Canada West. Cameron, you have the floor.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ellen, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We're joined by experts from across the country as well as guests from across the country, so it's going to be a really interesting discussion. As the host, first I'd like to take you through the panelists who will be joining us today. You can see on screen here and tell you a little bit more about them. And then we'll talk a little bit about the resources that we have available that we're drawing on for today's presentation. If we could just turn the page to that. Awesome, thank you. So as Ellen mentioned, my name's Cameron McFadden, and I'm the Vice President of Growth Strategy, which is a fancy name for business development here in Western Canada. So I deal with new and prospective customers who are looking to Ipsos to support them on their research needs. Our panels today are researchers and experts in their fields from all across the country. First, Kyle Braid works with me in the Vancouver office here. Kyle leads our public affairs business in Western Canada, working with both government and industry stakeholders. Greg Jack joins us from Ottawa, where he leads our Ottawa and our Capital Region business with, again, government and industrial stakeholders. Greg is also the lead researcher on our Trump tariffs and trade syndicated study, which we'll talk about again in a moment. Megan Miller is based in Halifax and is our expert in Atlantic Canada, and also is an expert in election and governmental polling, and contributes to many of our thought leadership programs for public affairs nationally. And finally, Martin Horowski is based in Toronto and leads our energy and transportation portfolio, as well as public affairs in Eastern Canada. So I'd like to thank all of them for joining us today. All have an important part to play in this presentation. And as a next slide, I'd just like to show you sort of where the resources are coming from that we're using to inform the study today. First, Ipsos Context and Ipsos Essentials are ongoing omnibus studies we run across Canada and around the world, actually, and have for many years. They're constantly keeping a pulse on consumer attitudes and behaviors as it relates to sort of issues of the day. What Worries the World is another global study that provides interesting context on this subject and informs some of the work we do with Global News, where we're the primary source of polling for all of their news work that they do, and Ipsos regularly contributes both on air and in background too. And finally, Trump Tariffs and Turmoil is a special study we've launched since January, which is available on an ongoing basis to subscribers and provides very specific context around these issues and consumer attitudes from north and south of the border. So something that our clients have really appreciated in somewhat tumultuous times, providing a lens on consumer attitude and behavior, as I said, in both Canada and the US. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for joining. Just a couple of housekeeping things. As Ellen mentioned, there will be a recording available of this webinar within a day or so, which we'll send out to you via email. Also available for viewing on the web, the same place you registered when you joined this call. And we don't share the deck as it is. Sometimes we get some requests to share the deck, but we are happy to book ad hoc or one-off presentations with folks who believe there'd be an audience that this would be interesting for. So if you are interested in seeing the data again or looking at it in different ways, please reach out. We'll share our contact information at the end of the session. And we'll be happy to set some time up to take you through very specifically or generally if there's value in it for you. With that, I'd like to turn it over to the researchers to share some insights on this subject. And we're going to start with Greg in Ottawa. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Cameron, and thanks everyone who has joined us today online. We're going to start with kind of a global look, and then we're going to zoom into Canada, and then we'll get a little more specific onto energy. So when we look at the top issues globally, we find that some of them are the same as what you might see in Canada, such as inflation, unemployment, and healthcare. And then others are maybe a little bit different than what you would see. What we don't see here is energy, and this is not even on the list. This is an issue that doesn't make the cut. It's not something that is being talked about or worried about globally. And you know, that I think is an important piece of context as we go into this presentation. Energy is a major driver of economic growth in the economy, and it's talked about a lot in the news media, but it's not registering as a top worry for people around the world. Here in Canada, as I said, we have issues such as healthcare, housing, and the economy at the top of the list. And energy here does make the list, but it's right at the bottom. Only 2% of Canadians, or 4% of 3% of Canadians are worried about energy, and 4% are worried about infrastructure. So the point here is that while energy is tremendously important to the Canadian economy, nobody is worried about it. Right now, of course, we're in an election campaign. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And we're going to talk about whether it's being discussed in the campaign and whether it should be. So we'll see how that plays out. Now, I want to talk a second about climate change, because climate change is an issue that has been a top priority, has been near the top of that list in what worries the world, and has now kind of dropped down. And I think that it's important to note that even though there's not as much discussion around climate change these days because of some of the issues around affordability and the economy, and of course what's going on south of the border, still half of Canadians think that Canada should be doing more in the fight against climate change. However, that is down from 57% in 2003. And concern over climate change impact, perhaps driven by wildfires and other natural events, is up 10% since 2002. And so as an issue, it's down further on the list because of, you know, as we were talking earlier at this group before we started the webinar of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's really important, but it's not urgent right now. Very few Canadians see Canada as a leader in climate change, and close to half of Canadians are worried that the transition, if it happens, to renewable energy is going to cost them money. So in an age of inflation and expenses, climate change is still an important issue. It's just further down the list, and it's been supplemented by the urgent. Now, looking at the urgent, one of those things that right now for people is urgent is their current financial situation. Right now, fear is driving a lot of decisions, and we've seen that in the markets. We've seen a crazy amount of movement, both down and then today up with the announcement by the president that he's pausing tariffs for 90 days on all countries except China. But what we do have in Canada right now is a virtual consensus that there's a fear that cost of living going up, and a fear that you know, as world events continue, people are going to be paying more out of their pocketbook. So the common theme, I think, is uncertainty around the world right now and the issues that people are worried about, and that's being driven a lot by fear. Now, as I mentioned, we are in a federal election at this point, and these are our latest Ipsos polling numbers that were released on April 3rd. We had a 12-point gap on the last poll between the Conservatives and the Liberals, and you can see obviously much has changed in the last 90 days. There was general consensus in the polls up until about January, February that the Conservatives were headed to a victory, and now we're seeing a rapid and quick shift where the Liberals are now leading. However, it's important to note that you know, there's other pollsters who have had similar results. That gap has been different depending on which source you look at, and we may have caught the peak of that Liberal wave. You know, usually Ipsos is accused of having a conservative bias, but in this case, it looks, or might look to some, that we have a Liberal one. So I think this just reflects a very, very volatile electorate right now, and a very engaged electorate on an election that really does matter. So this is, as we always say about polls, a snapshot in time. This is where we were last week, but the election is changing very quickly, and this is not necessarily where we are today. And so far in the campaign has been completely dominated by talk of Trump and how to retaliate or deal with the US. But with that 90-day pause that I mentioned that the president announced today, it's possible there might be more room for discussion in this campaign about other issues, which could include energy. So if you're interested in the election, we encourage you to join our next webinar, which is on the 15th of April. Dr. Daryl Bricker, who's the Global Ipsos Head of Public Affairs, will be joined by Sean Simpson, who's leading our election team, and Megan is actually one of the people working on that team as well. Daryl's doing an Ask Me Anything session, so literally what it sounds like. We can hope there'll be a lot of good discussion and an opportunity to ask questions from some very senior researchers about the election specifically. The URL is on the screen there, and then we'll have it put in the chat as well. Okay, so moving on to that Canada-US relations piece that I talked about. Right now, there's been effectively a breach of trust between Canada and the United States. 5 in 10 Canadians feel that we can never trust the Americans the same way again. Only 1 in 10 Americans are saying the same thing about Canada. And so what that suggests is that, for us in Canada, this is a very big issue. And the reason is that the tariffs were an economic threat, but the talk of annexation has effectively been an insult. Many people, 7 in 10 say that the relationship with the US has gotten worse over the past couple of weeks. We've been tracking that back to January. It's been relatively stable. So despite the tariffs coming in and then being lifted and then coming in again and then being lifted again, Canadians continue to feel that that relationship has deteriorated, and there's I think a risk of some long-term damage no matter how that ends up. So that's going to be really important as we talk a little bit later about markets and energy, because one of our biggest consumers of energy is the United States, and there's an opportunity now to have a discussion about whether and how we might want to change some of that. The other interesting stats, I think, and the other interesting point that we want to make here is there's an opportunity for leadership. There's an openness for somebody to step up and lead. Canadians are concerned about American companies coming in and taking over, and so 3/4 of them want the federal government to step in and protect Canadian companies by preventing US takeovers. I mentioned the opportunity. There's an opportunity for businesses to take some lead here. Half of Canadians trust businesses to help resolve that current dispute. And that number could be higher if some businesses were seen to be taking leadership roles and stepping up. We have seen some of that with companies making efforts to promote Canadian brands and support the Canadian economy and Canadian jobs. And on the flip side of that, 4 in 10 Canadians say that they've completely lost faith in our elected officials to manage that important Canada-US relationship. So there's an opening right now for leadership on this issue, whether it's business or government who fills it. And that obviously is going to include some leadership on the energy file. So I'll turn it over to Martin to talk a little bit more about some of our energy specific findings.
Thanks, Greg. So now we're going to start to get into the meat of some of the energy and electricity issues that we recently asked in some polling that we conducted late last week. So these results are very fresh and very hot off the press, so to speak. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we track here at Ipsos is support for electricity generation. We've been tracking this for many decades to understand the ups and downs of preferences in regards to electricity. As we can see here below, support continues to be very strong for renewable energy. That despite the fact, as my colleague Greg has mentioned, that increasingly Canadians concerned about the affordability and increasingly Canadians concerned about the energy transition towards renewable energy. Support for renewable sources as a source of generation is still very high. Hydroelectric power, solar power, almost all Canadians supporting this form of generation. Wind power as well, very high support. Looking at natural gas, this has also stayed pretty consistent. Looking back to some results in 2023, 3/4 of Canadians support using natural gas to generate electricity. Where we've really seen a shift over the course of the last year and a half is support for nuclear energy. So since late 2023, we've seen a significant increase in the proportion of Canadians who support nuclear, up to 62%. So that's a 7-point difference over the course of the last 16 months, quite a significant jump in a relatively small amount of time. We also asked about oil, about half Canadians supporting this form of generation, noting that support highest in Western Canada, and support for coal, only a minority of Canadians support this, and it continues to drop off. Next slide, please. So looking at nuclear in particular, and this is where we've seen a lot of growth in support. There's been a lot of discussion about expansion of nuclear generating facilities, particularly in Ontario, in addition to refurbishment, SMRs, so-called renaissance of nuclear energy around the world. In Ontario in particular, where the majority of Canada's nuclear infrastructure is located, we've reached a historic high. And in a high in support that's very similar to renewable energy. So right now, 8 in 10 Ontarians support using nuclear energy to support generation. Again, that's an all-time high that we've seen in all the tracking that we've conducted over the last couple decades. Other demographic groups that tend to be more supportive of nuclear today include those Canadians who are born outside of Canada, older Canadians, conservative supporters, but we'll mention as well as liberal supporters, so pretty even support there for nuclear energy, as well as men. On the flip side, in terms of where we see support the lowest, it's in Quebec. This has historically been an area of lower support for nuclear. That has a lot to do with the abundance of hydro in Quebec, although this is increasing slowly as well as rural Canadians, younger Canadians, NDP supporters, and Green and women, also less likely to be supportive of nuclear. And now I'll hand it over. Thank you.
Thank you. So, what does our public opinion data tell us about the ways views are shifting in light of ongoing international issues, particularly when it comes to Canada and the US? So we find, in fact, that in current circumstances where Canadians are thinking more about investing in energy security, there is more support for greater investment in different energy sources, including oil and gas. So over 4 in 10 Canadians say they become more supportive of developing oil and gas projects as a result of disputes with the US. In fact, around 1 in 5 say that they've become much more supportive in the past few weeks. Second to this, just over 1/3 say their opinion hasn't changed, but very few say that the current circumstances have made them less supportive of new oil and gas projects. And if we get to the next slide. This isn't just for oil and gas either. So when it comes to the development of opportunities for energy and resource projects more broadly, Canadians see the need for production to move faster in light of current trade disputes. So 1/4 of Canadians say that we need to act fast on developing energy programs, actively pushing obstacles out of the way at all costs in order to do so. Just over 4 in 10 say we need to move faster than before, but with some caution. But overall, this amounts to nearly 70% who see some degree of urgency in the way that we need to proceed on this issue. So demographically, there are some differences in who feels more strongly about Canada moving quickly on the issue relative to other groups. So belief that Canada needs to act fast at all costs or otherwise move faster than before is higher among Conservative voters, though again, it is still high among Liberals, among those in BC, Alberta, among men, and among those 55 plus. It tends to be lower among NDP voters, those in Quebec, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, those under 34, and among women. But it's important to note that even though certain groups may be more likely to support quicker movement than others, support for Canada moving faster than we are today is generally pretty consistent and high, even among groups on the lower end of the spectrum. So then what does this look like in terms of support for specific actions or projects, things that policymakers can do to implement this quicker movement? So we tested 20 different ideas, and we'll lay them out in terms of degree of support from strong to weak among Canadians. So starting off with areas where Canadians express the most support, given what Martin said, as one might suspect, Canadians are highly supportive of investment in renewable energy sources, but also building more east-west electricity distribution lines and more hydroelectric power projects. They're also highly supportive of investments to remove regulatory barriers, for example, establishing clear maximum timeframes for regulatory decision-making, and increasing staffing and resources to make regulatory agencies more efficient. So support for east-west distribution lines, hydroelectric dams, and maximum timeframes for decision-making is higher among men and those 55 plus, while support for renewable energy projects, increased staffing for regulatory agencies, those types of things tends to be consistent across demographic groups, but favored by Liberal voters compared to Conservative voters. So with that, I'll kind of hand it back over to Kyle to talk about the areas that have a little bit softer support than these.
Well, thank you, Megan. We're going to move to softer support, but still pretty broad support for these 3 projects. 2 of them are actual projects related to oil, an east-west pipeline, and investing in oil refineries. But the one on the left is something that both parties have had almost identical wording on around speeding up the project permitting process. Clearly support for that. 2/3 of Canadians saying they support that. Fewer than 2 in 10 saying that's something that they oppose. On the oil front, both the East-West pipeline and investing more in oil refineries, pretty similar numbers. But even here, where you've got 2/3 of Canadians saying that they support moving ahead faster with these kinds of things, there are some signs of opposition or less support for both of those oil issues. Clearly, we got higher support, as you'd expect, in Alberta, 80% plus, but in Quebec, it's closer to 50%, so bare majorities in Quebec, so there are some stark regional differences there. And almost as big as the regional differences, we see differences between men and women, with men reflecting Alberta numbers, women reflecting Quebec numbers. Similar by age, older Canadians, much higher in the high 70s for these, compared to younger Canadians in the low 50% of support. One thing that we do see, though, is while we see higher support among Conservative voters, it's still pretty high among Liberal voters. Liberal voters are pretty close to that overall average. The Conservatives get up into the 80s, and it's New Democrats in the bloc that are quite a bit lower, dragging the numbers down compared to where the Conservatives are. Now we move into things that I'd call more moderate support. These numbers here actually look an awful lot like typical energy projects that I and Ipsos have asked about over the last decade or so, maybe even the last 15 years. Typically, most projects as a default in Canada tend to get somewhere support in the high 50s, somewhere around 60%. And by default, there's around 20 to 25% of Canadians on the issue who default to the negative. So these look an awful lot like that. 3 of these relate to specific types of projects, but one, reducing Canada's greenhouse gas emission targets, is not so much about a project as about an idea. This is not a number I think we would have seen a few years ago before affordability and inflation became an issue. Canadians still care about climate change, but the relative priority of climate change and affordability has shifted. And interestingly, this is one of the areas where there's hardly any differences by party, by age, by region. Almost everyone is in near that 6 in 10 level of supporting, taking another look at Canada's greenhouse gas emission targets. However, on all 3 of the other projects, you see the same things that I saw before. Some pretty big differences by region, especially in Quebec. Lower numbers for all of them, only 44% saying they support an additional pipeline, something like a Trans Mountain, to transport oil to coastal ports for export. That one's obviously quite a bit higher in Alberta. Same age differences and same political differences, with both parties, voters generally in support, the Conservatives just a little bit higher. Now I will turn it over to Martin, who will talk for where the support continues to slip.
Thanks, Kyle. So now looking at kind of your slim majority support, so just hovering around 50%. Looking at support for investing in new nuclear power facilities, 52% of Canadians supporting that. Obviously support the highest in Ontario, lowest in Quebec, as I mentioned before, with support for nuclear energy, but still showing increases in Western Canada as well. In terms of opening up more offshore exploration in Atlantic Canada, 53% of Canadians support this. Looking at Atlantic Canadians specifically, support's actually quite higher at 63%. So residents that live in the region are more supportive of drilling in their own region than the average Canadian. And then in terms of increased oil and gas production by removing the production cap, just a very slim majority of Canadians supporting this. So 52% of Canadians supporting the increased production of oil and gas. Next slide, please. So now we're getting into the areas of lower support. So we're looking at below the 50% level. Now we're talking more about oil and gas specifically, and we're talking more specifically as well about environmental protections, where we see less support. So just starting on the left again, in terms of opening up offshore exploration in the Arctic specifically, so 49%, just under half of Canadians supporting that, compared to 35% of Canadians who oppose it. In terms of removing the tanker ban in BC, 42% of Canadians support it. So still more Canadians supporting it than opposing it. But if you'll note, there's about 3 in 10 Canadians who don't know. They probably don't know what the tanker ban is in BC. In terms of fracking for oil and gas extraction, Canadians are pretty undecided, pretty equally in opposition and support. Again, 24% of Canadians saying that they don't know. Looking at some of those more kind of hardcore changes in terms of development, opening up lands for development, including protected areas. So here's where we start to see more Canadians opposing this measure than supporting. Only about 4 in 10 Canadians saying that they support that. And looking at loosening the requirements for environmental protection specifically, more Canadians opposing, about half of Canadians oppose that compared to 37% who support that. Looking at that specifically, at the loosening of environmental regulations, we see some really interesting divisions among Canadians. So looking politically, Conservative supporters are much more likely to support the loosening of environmental regulations compared to Liberal supporters, 59 compared to 29%. On gender, men are twice as likely to support a loosening of requirements in this regard compared to women, and also new Canadians are more likely to support the loosening of environmental regulations compared to those born in Canada. Next slide, please. So just looking at the political divide, again, seeing that we're in an election, it's a hot topic that I think we're all interested in learning more about. So as Kyle mentioned, there's a lot of areas where Conservative and Liberal voters see things in common, where there's not a big divergence on energy and electricity issues. Notably, that has to do with regulatory decisions, the permitting process, right? The vast majority of both Conservative and Liberal supporters support speeding up this process, simplifying this process, and that's perhaps not that surprising given that both campaigns have made recent announcements in this regard. We also see equal levels of support among Conservatives and Liberal supporters for investments in electricity infrastructure, whether it's new nuclear, whether it's more east-west distribution as opposed to north-south distribution, whether it's hydroelectric or other forms of renewable energy. We see that support is high equally among both Conservative and Liberal supporters. Next slide, please. Where we see a divergence in support among the two largest parties has to do on issues associated with oil and gas in particular, and also in terms of some of those environmental protections that we talked about. So when you look at topics like fracking, removing tanker bans, increasing oil and gas production, we do see a significant divergence between Conservative and Liberal supporters. However, on that last note, in terms of increasing oil and gas production, whether it's offshore in Atlantic Canada or the Arctic, there's still almost half of Liberal supporters on the same page, however, significantly more Conservatives. And then on the last note there, in terms of new lands for development, including protected areas, which is kind of one of the, what would be one of the largest kind of regulatory changes, a divergence again. Of note, only 52% of Conservative voters support that, however, significantly less Liberal voters. I'll hand it back to you, Kyle.
Thank you. So we'll stick with the political, and we'll go to the question that we often ask in these campaigns: which parties best to deal with various issues, which leaders best to have a beer with, those kinds of things. We asked that specifically about the management of energy and resources in Canada. We asked it 3 different ways. We asked it in the middle there, who's best to deal with these issues to ensure we proceed in an environmentally responsible and sustainable manner. On the left, to create jobs and grow the economy, and then the balance of those. We've asked these questions many times in surveys before, and if I'm being totally honest, when we started fielding these, I expected to see the Liberals ahead on the environment, the Conservatives ahead on the economy, and it was an open question as to who was going to be leading on the balance. But we found something interesting in our release yesterday. On the environment, yes, the Liberals are ahead by 9 points as the party best to deal with those issues. A little bit of love for the New Democrats and some for the Greens in terms of environmental protection, but generally a lead for the Liberals over the Conservatives. That was to be expected. This was not to be expected. The Liberals also lead on these issues in terms of who's best to manage them to create jobs and grow the economy. The Greens and the New Democrats lose a little bit here. Both the Conservatives and the Liberals move up a bit, but still Liberals ahead. The Liberals ahead in most of the country other than Alberta and perhaps Saskatchewan. So a bit of a surprise here to see them ahead there. And when we go to who's better on balance for economic opportunities and environmental concerns, again, the Liberals actually expand their lead and have a pretty decisive lead at this point on these issues, 38% to 25% over the Conservatives. Just to expand on that, this is a look at who leads on the overall balance of economic and opportunities, environmental concerns when it comes to energy and resources. Overall, in the middle, you can see the Liberals lead by 13. That was that 38 to 25%. The Conservatives on the left, they lead only with 2 of our demographics. Rural Canadians, they lead by 12 points. And in Alberta, overall, they only lead by 4 points in our current poll, which was a real surprise. The Liberals dominate these energy and resource issues, a 30-point lead among educated Canadians, university grads. They lead in Atlantic Canada, Ontario by substantial margins. They would lead in Quebec too, except the Bloc comes into play there and takes some of the support away from the Liberals in that area, but they do lead significantly there. And they lead in urban communities and among women. So some substantial advantages here. Even as Greg pointed out earlier, that this was a moment in time poll, we had the Liberals ahead 12. Even if we were where some others are now, a 6 to 8 point Liberal lead, the Liberals would still be leading on these energy issues, slightly smaller leads, but they would still be leading. So it is advantage Liberal on these issues at this point. Now I will turn it over to Greg to talk about which markets for export we're talking about can sometimes play a role.
Thanks, Kyle. And yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier, there's opportunities coming out of this. Whatever party is victorious in the next election, we've already just heard a lot about what kinds of projects Canadians support and what they want to see. So we're going to go back to the Canada-US issue for a moment, because obviously, as I mentioned earlier, the United States is by far our biggest export market, and that includes energy. But Canadians, in light of the current dispute with the US and current circumstances, are saying that our future is better served to align with like-minded countries like Europe, and that's 7 in 10. What I think is more interesting is the fact that Canadians, really want us to be focusing on removing interprovincial trade barriers. And we've heard a lot about this during the campaign. There's been a lot of media coverage. Both parties, or all the parties, in fact, have said that they would do something to reduce or remove interprovincial trade barriers. But on energy, there's a lot of areas where we could do that. Martin talked about an east-west electricity pipeline. We've talked about an east-west oil pipeline. We've talked about nuclear. Ontario is a world leader in nuclear, and it has a lot of expertise that could be offered. And there's other areas where some of those energy expertise and issues and advantages from some provinces could benefit others. It could also mean new liquid natural gas opportunities for places like Europe coming out of BC. We've been talking about that for years when we talk about serving Europe. Germany asked for liquid natural gas in 2023 when the war with Germany started, and we could revisit that. Unfortunately, at the time, the Prime Minister offered them hydrogen instead, but there are levels of openness among the Canadian population right now to look at other markets, number one, and to look at all forms of energy as part of that Canadian advantage, number two. So we have an opportunity to diversify, something we've talked about for years, but the current crisis might force us to actually finally act on it, and that would be a good thing, according to Canadians. Now, when we look at the two markets that we talk about the most, which are Asia or China and Europe, there's stronger support for developing infrastructure to export oil and natural gas to Europe. 66% or 2 in 3 agree. When it comes to China, we have half agreeing, and that's a little bit surprising for 2 reasons. The first reason is the number is actually higher than I expected it to be. Given all of the talk about China in the last 5 years, and the issues we've had diplomatically with that country, there's still, substantial support. 1 in 2 Canadians saying that they would support exporting to China, although it's worth noting that 1 in 4 don't know enough to say. On the other hand, the level of support for China is quite a bit lower than it is for Europe. And so when we look at the types of markets we want to diversify to, and we've talked about this again for a long time, selling our energy to like-minded countries that support democracy and share Canadian values, that's something that we found over a decade of polling is something that Canadians can get behind. And now it seems like they're open to specifics around different forms of energy and specific markets such as Europe. So I would take that China number with a grain of salt, and obviously energy companies that are looking to expand to Asia would be well advised to talk about Asia generally and not zero in on China specifically. Now back to Kyle to wrap things up.
All right, we've got a few minutes left, so I'll go through this fairly quickly. Some obvious things stand out from the poll. As Megan highlighted, there is more openness than before to many energy and resource projects, including oil and gas projects for Canadians. There's clearly support, 7 in 10 Canadians saying that they want the parties to move more quickly, and the parties themselves say that they are going to make things happen to move more quickly. But here's the but, it's not an everything, everywhere, all at once for Canadians. I showed you some of the numbers, or told you some of the numbers around Quebec. Younger Canadians, lower support for these things. Women, Martin pointed out where the vast differences are between the two sets of party supporters on several of these projects. And so for a lot of these things, that were on the list, the Conservatives say they want to do it all. For Canadians, it may not be an outright no for a lot of these things, but at best it's a hesitant maybe for things like removing the production cap, fracking, removing a tanker ban, opening up new lands. And on the environmental front, while it is a yes from Canadians to an expedited process to get things approved, I didn't see anything in the survey or anywhere else that suggests Canadians want to lower standards related to the environment. It's really just do things faster, but the same standards are going to apply for getting projects approved as before. In addition, we got a debate coming up. I think that this is an opportunity for the Conservatives. They're trailing in this issue, but I still think it's an opportunity for them. I think they can keep hammering at the idea that you can't trust the Liberals to get things done, to actually do new projects, to actually do it faster based on their record over the last 10 years. But the challenge for them is several. One, as much as we want these issues to be important, and I'm sure the people on this call want these issues to be important, it is a lower priority for issue with Canadians. It doesn't compete with affordability, it doesn't compete with housing, it doesn't compete with healthcare. And anyone who's done work on this file knows how hard it is to move numbers on these issues, not only to move numbers, but even to get Canadians to care about these issues, to put their hands up, even if they're supportive, to speak up on these issues. It's tough to move things on these issues. Another problem for the Conservatives is they do want to do everything, but Canadians are not necessarily aligned with that approach. The balanced approach is still something that Canadians like. And third, a challenge for the Conservatives is inevitably these energy issues are tied in with the economy, our US relationship, Canadian sovereignty, all three areas of which currently are owned by the Liberals and not the Conservatives. So it's going to be tough for them to really make a break on these issues on their own. And I'll turn it over to Greg for the last point.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. And I think the last point is one that's really worth reflecting on, because it's not about government. It's about companies that really drive our economy and provide those jobs that everybody is talking about. And so any energy company right now in the current environment with strong ties to Canada can point to some of the things that they're bringing to the Canadian economy in terms of jobs, providing energy, their presence in Canadian communities. There's really never been a better time to wrap yourself in the flag, as it were, and brag about those bona fides. That's been a shift from over the last 10 years, when that might not have been as en vogue. Now people are very much looking for supporting Canada and signals from companies that say they support Canada. In the Trump tariffs and turmoil study that we mentioned, showed you some of the data from, We see a lot of brands who are looking for ways to make their Canadianness known, from labeling to products sourcing and that sort of thing. For Canadian energy companies, there's a chance for them to talk about their contribution to the economy and the great things that our energy brings to Canada and makes this one of the best countries in the world. There's a chance to reignite some pride in Canadian energy, which I don't think we've had in a long time. There's support for this coast to coast, even in Quebec, although to a lesser degree, we're seeing Quebecers sign on to some of these Canadian Pride initiatives and Buy Canadian that we might not have seen before. And there's a clamoring for leadership from business. So while the current dispute with the US has met many challenges, probably with more to come, it's also an opportunity for Canada and for Canadian energy companies or energy companies with ties to Canada if they can take it.
Thanks very much, Greg and Kyle and Martin and Megan. Really interesting stuff. And I've just been watching the questions here, and there's a few that have come through. So we'll finish up with a couple and get your thoughts on these things. The first one, which I think you touched on at one point, Kyle, was how do you think these results would have been different 6 months ago? What's moved and what we've seen 6 months ago versus today?
Sorry. Greg, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. No, I think obviously, Cameron, a lot has changed in 6 months, and we saw that in the polling on vote, how that really shifted. I don't want to overstate it, but the return of President Trump has upended a lot of things and has compounded some problems that were already brewing below the surface. So I would say 6 months ago, we wouldn't have had this level of support for some of these things. I would say that people might not have been as tuned in and paying attention to it as much. And I think that now everybody is paying a lot more attention to anything Canadian and anything to do with the US. And obviously we're in an election campaign, which is probably explaining some of that. But the change that has happened over the last 6 months in terms of the world order and the world trade order itself is really significant. And we're going to see how the next 6 months go. We're going to see how the rest of the election goes. But as I alluded to earlier, there's an opportunity right now, I think, that the Canadian businesses can take advantage of and should to help grow our country.
And I would just add, I mean, the main thing, which certainly the numbers at who's best to deal with these issues would have been not only the complete opposite. The Conservatives would have been ahead by double digits on all those things. But the other thing I would just add is, while I think support for these projects has probably risen, they haven't risen by 20%. Most of them have probably only risen by 3 to 5. 10 is probably too much of a stretch. So they've gone up, but they haven't dramatically changed.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Were there any questions in the poll about Indigenous rights?
Good question. Certainly something that we considered and we probably should have included, but that's not something that people are talking about in the campaign changes there. Nobody's suggesting, a change to consultation. So I wrote a question at one point about just the same as loosening environmental regulations. I did one about loosening Indigenous consultations, and it, to be honest, felt inappropriate because nobody's talking about it. I almost considered dropping the question about loosening environmental protections for a similar reason, but sometimes it's good to have a floor question so that people can have something that they oppose, something that's going to be the opposite of the renewables, which everybody we know supports. So a good point about Indigenous, but it's not something that any of the campaigns are really talking about changing.
Okay, good context. Thank you. A question about climate change. You show some shifting views on climate change and an openness to less strict Canadian emission goals. Is that a shift in views about climate change? Is that just the current economy, or are people realizing that Canada is not a big global contributor and their expectations are changing?
Yeah,
Megan, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, I think I can speak to that. So kind of what we've been saying throughout is that it's not necessarily that this is a less important issue in general, but given the current kind of cost of living crisis, affordability concerns, it's just something that's being deprioritized. You know, that said, when extreme weather events happen, you know, we had the Jasper wildfires, we had floods and fires in Nova Scotia in the past few years. This does tend to rise to the top and people start thinking about it more and more, but it's more so in terms of Canadians being concerned about what's directly in front of them, how are they going to put food on the table, concerns around housing, kind of dominating viewpoints right now.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. And finally, there's one more here. Does the level of support for projects like you have in this poll actually translate to real support when you're talking about specific projects in your region or near your community?
I can take that question. It totally depends on the type of project, right? We saw a divergence in support on things specifically relating to oil and gas, right? So there's definitely a regional divergence there. There's a divergence in terms of voters. There's a divergence in terms of gender. However, when we're talking about more kind of energy or electricity specifically infrastructure projects like the transmission grids, like generation capacity, I assume things like reliability, you know, adding to that, there's definitely a consensus. So definitely more support for those things. But in terms of oil and gas, to Kyle and Greg and Megan, what we've mentioned, there's some more support there than in the past, but there's still the trepidation. The impacts on the environment has not gone away, so people are still thinking about that, in particular on oil and gas. Yeah.
Right. Really interesting. Okay, well, that's the end of our questions and the end of our presentation today. I just want to take one more chance to thank all our panelists, Kyle, Greg, Martin, Megan. Really appreciate you taking the time today. Some really interesting insight. Just a reminder on those housekeeping items, you will get a link within a day or so to watch the panel again. And that registration link remains open. If you have colleagues who you thought would have enjoyed the content or benefited from some of the things we covered today, they're still able to go and register and watch the recording in the future. So please feel free to pass that along. And if you are interested in any of the specifics of the data we covered today or in a presentation for your organization, please feel free to reach out. Our email addresses are all along the bottom here. And any one of us can facilitate that. So thank you again. Thank you for joining us, to our panel from across the country and our guests from across the country. I hope this was a great use of your time, and I'll hand things back to Ellen to finish things off.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Cameron said all the thank yous, and to be on the lookout for the recording. It will come certainly tomorrow-ish. Please join us for our next Ask Us Anything webinar on April 15. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.